I'm just going to do that. Right. Okay, so welcome to the RARI seminar series. And again, thank you very much for the introduction, Andrew. I am delighted to be speaking to you all today about contact and cattle, which is based on research coming out of my master's dissertation, looking at cattle as important indicators of contact in South African rock art studies. So when we talk about contact, we're talking about change in San hunter-gatherer lifeways in the second millennium AD with the later Stone Age. Now, rock art research has focused on contact beginning 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, within the last 2 decades particularly. And these context studies have often been interested in changes within the imagery. So that's particularly relating to eland imagery, ritual, material culture, and domesticates as a proxy for other processes. So this is looking at domesticates in terms of relative dating, part of agropastoralist ceremonies, San ritual, and domesticate raiding parties. So what we can see there is that there isn't really a focus on the cattle themselves. So we don't have a typology or style or an understanding of cattle and how they are painted in relation to how other imagery is painted. So that is what I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today. Um, Slide change. I hope it's still with me. So in order to do this, obviously there's thousands and thousands and thousands of paintings, and the area with which to do any of this research is very large. So we selected the Maclear district as a zone with which to study cattle imagery, and obviously to make it size enough for a master's dissertation. So the Maclear district is now part of the larger Joe district, but for the purpose of the dissertation, we will still be calling it the Maclear district because it's a very particular area, which is also related to quite a lot of previous rock art studies done, and is part of a larger research group. So I'll be calling it the Maclear district. Now, in the Maclear district, there are 160 sites which are photographed and recorded on errata alone. So this is particularly based on errata, and that is the African Rock Art Digital Archive, which was previously known as SARADA, to those of you who might be familiar. Now, just a little bit more about the study area. It is located within the Maloti-Drakensberg mountains. So we're looking at this area over here in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. And it is a long-standing or of long-standing importance within rock art research studies with thousands and thousands of sites. So it's really an ideal spot to begin looking at cattle in rock art. The area in itself has gone through quite a lot of turmoil, and some of the name changes, even at present, are a reflection of that. So the Eastern Cape, you might come across it as the Transkei. In previous literature, it was even known as East Griqualand, very briefly. And the area in which the Maclear district is located has also been called Nomansland, as it was known in the mid-1800s and published within Blundell 2004. So there's been quite a lot of name changes. Maclear town has now also had its name changed, and as I said, the district is now part of a larger district. So it really is an area with a very complex social political context, historically and in the present. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the archaeological evidence for the arrival of domestic livestock, in the Eastern Cape, it is sporadic due to the small number of excavated sites. However, we do know that cattle are present in the area at least 2,000 years ago, along with fat-tailed sheep. But previously, the area was peopled entirely by San hunter-gatherers, as they are known collectively, who are responsible for the fine line rock painting tradition. So if you have a look at the map, you can see that the area we're looking at, which is the Eastern Cape, does have a concentration of sheep and cattle located within. Now, there is a considerable increase in the archaeological material for domestic livestock roughly 1,500 years ago. So you can see that that same area now has a much larger population of archaeological material. So we know that there is an increase, particularly in cattle. So what we know is that nomadic pastoralists or Khoi speakers came with sheep and cattle into the Eastern Cape in the early Iron Age. Agropastoralists or Nguni speakers arrive in the late Iron Age, and this is the period marked with an increase in cattle remains. So that's just to give you a bit of context about the area that we're looking at and how cattle are part of that landscape. Right, so cattle in the rock art itself. Out of the 160 sites within Maclear, 27 contained at least one identifiable cattle representation. As cattle themselves have not been a focus of analysis within rock art studies, there was no precedent for defining the characteristics within the rock art itself. So in order to begin doing that and unpacking how they are being painted, we have to simply ask, firstly, how? And what are the phenotypical characteristics and how are they diagnostic? So that's talking about the physical features found in cattle in life versus how they're being represented in the rock art. And then the next step is how do they compare to other large painted bovids? So particularly eland, which dominate San hunter-gatherer imagery. So this is basically the foundation of the research, which is coming out of my master's, is how do we go about identifying these cattle to begin with? This is just to give you a general idea of the Maclear district and the spread of sites with cattle across the study area. So you can see that the population of sites spreads across the whole area and is quite evenly distributed. So it's not concentrated or isolated in any way, which tells us that these paintings aren't an isolated event. And just to anyone who's interested, the location of previously Maclear Town is highlighted in the white text box. So you can see in relation to the rest of the Maclear district, this is where Maclear is located. So before we get into the nitty-gritty details of cattle, I would like to firstly show you some of the prime examples of cattle depicted at the rock art sites in the Maclear district. So on the left, you have an example of a traced and digitally redrawn image from one of the sites in Maclear. And on the right-hand side, there is a photograph which has been through D-stretch correlation, courtesy of Harman, to enhance the pigment coloration. So what we have on the left, which I think is a bit clearer to look at, is a bull patterned in black and white with really beautiful horns, which have been preserved, as well as a really clear form. This is superimposed onto earlier fine line paintings, most probably San, which have been painted in red, and you can see the red coming through the photograph. And on top of both of these, you have these smaller black human figures, which are often associated with more recent paintings. So you have really nice layering going on in this example. And I just, there we go. From the same site, which is particularly prolific in cattle imagery, it's located along the Little Pot River in Woodhouse. There are two more examples of sort of prime cattle imagery, really good preservation. And we can see here this black bull has really lovely horns, which I'll refer to as lyre-shaped. So that's lyre as in the instrument, and the pole, which is the center of the forehead. And on the right-hand side, you can see a cow with her calf slightly less well preserved. She would have been black entirely, but now you can see there's still lovely features, lots of form to work with here. Do let me know if it cuts out at any point. Sorry. And at a site located slightly further up the valley, so that's still the Little Pot Valley. It was the ideal spot for cattle imagery. We have this lovely herd of pure white cattle. So in this case, the black represents white. And they're bulls. You can see the penile sheath, which clearly marks them as bulls. And you can also see that the two individuals have two different horn shapes, which is particularly interesting because we've got individualized animals here. We've got the lovely lyre shape, which I was speaking about earlier, and then a slightly smaller variation. Unfortunately, the third animal, the preservation is lost, but you can just see the tip of one of the horns. So that's just an example of some of the imagery we're getting in Maclear. And now, without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the cattle themselves. So there has been limited research on the archaeohistorical domesticated cattle in South Africa. This is largely due to the very limited archaeofaunal remains and only very recent genetic studies. So the work which I did and the sort of analysis I composed is based predominantly on the genetic studies and historical accounts. Because without the archaeofaunal remains, we don't really have those phenotypical features to work with. So this is largely historical, but it is highly likely that these three breeds I'm going to speak about were the breeds coming into the country during that point of contact. There will, of course, be variation because when working with breeds, you can mix. So some features may have been lost or might have changed slightly. And you'll see a little bit of that as I start to talk about the Afrikaner, for example. So the Afrikaner cattle breed is red monochrome cattle with previously short horns. So you can see in the image that these are definitely not short horns by any standard, but they are most likely the breed brought into the country by Khoi-speaking pastoralists. So they would probably have entered on the west coast coming into the country. And the breed standard, which you can see pictured above with the long horns, was created due to a mixing with a Dutch breed, which was introduced later in 1780. So unfortunately, we don't have an example of what the shorter horned Afrikaner might have looked like. We only have the long horned example. So obviously that's something to keep in mind when we're looking at the paintings. On the right-hand side, we have the Drakensberg cattle breed. So this is a bull. They are normally black monochrome. And sorry, for those of you who don't know, monochrome is singular color. So the Afrikaner is red and the Drakensberg is black. And they are cattle with short horns and a particularly stocky build. They are named Drakensberger due to the association with the Drakensberg Mountains. So that's based on their location, and they are most likely the breed associated with agropastoralists in the highlands. So we're talking about modern day Lesotho and possibly the Free State. So that's sort of the area we're going to expect to find Drakensberger cattle. And the third and final cattle breed is the Nguni. Now, the Nguni are a slight breed with very high genetic variation of phenotypical features. So what that means is that they have highly variable coat patterns and horn shapes. They are typically of the longhorn variety, but clearly you can see just based on the structure of this herd on the left and right that they are very much individualized. So each individual is very distinctive, has a different combination of coat, color, horn shape, and even size variation. So they really are quite variable. They are named Nguni due to their historical and present association with Nguni-speaking agropastoralists. So what that means is wherever we see examples of Nguni occupation, we're going to expect to have Nguni cattle accompanying them. Now, that's not to say that any of these breeds is only to be associated with those individual groups, because of course that's not how things work. You know, cattle move, people are exchanging cattle, people are stealing cattle, people are breeding cattle. So this is just a very basic structure of what we're expecting to see, but it's important to understand what our indigenous cattle look like if we hope to understand what our paintings look like. So this is just a start. And part of that was to look particularly at the horns, because in case you didn't quite notice, they are quite distinguishable from each other. So here is a diagram of the Drakensberger breed. So this is what we expect to see from our shorthorn black Drakensberger cattle. In this case, there's not much sexual differentiation, and that's due, unfortunately, to the dehorning practice which currently goes on. So we don't really have examples of historical Drakensbergers with horns. Then we have the Afrikaner. This is the most likely representation of a female. So this is her in her mature form. And on the right-hand side, you have an example of a mature bull. So if you can see, there's an extra twist, and it's quite distinctive. And if you remember from earlier, I was talking about the poll, which is the center of the forehead. This is quite prominent. So if we had to see it painted, we would hopefully be able to see that pole and the structure of the horn. Our final example is the Nguni. Now, as you can see, they really do have quite a variety. These are just some of the most common that I was able to identify, and some of the preferred horn shapes. So obviously when we breed livestock and domesticates, we choose particular forms we wish to continue. And in this case, the ideal seems to be the lyre-shaped horn. So this is this beautifully curved horn with an extra flick at the end, which makes it look almost identical to a lyre instrument, which is basically a very small harp. So that's what we're expecting to see. Right, so now we have an idea of how indigenous cattle might have looked historically, but how are cattle being painted? So in order to begin looking at the distinction between cattle and other large bovids painted in the rock art, I looked at a set of polychrome eland and polychrome cattle. Unfortunately, we don't have polychrome cattle being painted in Maclear. So this is an example, which you can see on the right-hand side from the Stormberg. The eland painted on the left is from Maclear. So the Stormberg is not particularly far away, but just to note that this is not within the study area and was just used purely as a comparison. Now, one of the things we've been talking about are the horns. So let's look quickly at the eland. Elands have straight horns facing backwards towards the shoulder, and they're often described as being parallel. So we can see that there are horns in this direction going like this. Whereas with cattle, they are variable and have a wide placement parallel to the horns. So they're not facing back towards the shoulder. They're often, if you look straight on at an individual, at a cow, you will see them going towards the side of the head rather than going backwards. So that really is one of the key distinguishing features. Another being the tail. Cattle particularly have a much thicker tail with a long switch. So the switch is the bit at the end of the tail which has the hair. So that's particularly pronounced in cattle. And the final variation, which is very distinguishable besides the coat pattern, is the spine. So with the eland on the left, we can see that the spine has a sort of M shape, which has really lovely curves and articulates lower down at the shoulder, whereas the cattle on the right has a very straight spine. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a shoulder hump, because that is often the case with bulls. They have a slightly more pronounced shoulder hump, but they tend to have a hump and then a straight spine. So if you combine all of those features together, we have a really good idea of what we're expecting to see when cattle are being represented in the rock art. And here are some examples. So on the left, you can see that we have an individual which is painted quite well, but the preservation is lacking on the horns. So we don't have the horns as an identifiable feature. What we do have is a patterned coat, which is very much unlike that of an eland. And we have the other features we've mentioned. So we have the lovely straight spine, we've got a lovely tail with a long switch, and on the right-hand side, you have an ideal cattle type with all the elements described in the comparison. So here we can even see what it might look like with the hump at the shoulder, and then to have the straight spine following that. Now, this individual is painted in black and white, and has a very individualized pattern. So that becomes really important. By understanding some of these phenotypical features, we can begin to look at examples that we might previously not have been able to identify as cattle. So the example on the left has some of those features we've been speaking about, but it lacks the front. So this is not preserved. We don't have the paint in this area, so we can't use the horns as a distinguishing feature. But what we do have is a lovely straight spine, beautiful patterned coat. In this case, the dots or the stipples represent a color. So this is black and red. And then we have a lovely tail with a defined switch. Now this makes it really nice and easy to look at these guys over here as cattle. So I think most of you would go, well, these are cattle, and not really know why you'd say that. So the whole point of this was to establish some of those typologies that we would then expect to see. And in this example, we have cattle with very exaggerated features, particularly the horns, and that's just due to the style. So it's been painted in a slightly rougher manner with a thicker brush, possibly even finger painted in some areas. So by establishing what we expect to see when we see cattle, we know, right, these are most definitely cattle. Now, cattle are not painted in isolation. So in order to establish these phenotypical elements, and allow us to examine slightly more complex imagery, I had a look at some sites where we have cattle painted in slightly different contexts. So what I've shown you are cattle which are quite isolated for the most part, very distinctly cattle, and once you know what to look for, quite easy to identify. But I'm going to quickly show you 3 sites where it is not necessarily as obvious, or the context is particularly interesting. So these images, which you can see on screen, are copies made by Stowe, and they are relevant for the 2 sites in particular that I'm going to be showing you. This one here on the left shows a copy of an eland, which is clearly superimposed by a bull in bright red. So here we've got a very interesting relationship between eland and cattle. And above on the right, we have a copy of a bull, which we can see based on the horns, with entoptic dots and lines. So they're on the body, the main area. And this is considered to be a rain animal, or specifically a rain bull. So this is the one I want you to focus on for the first example. This is site 1, which is extracted from a very large panel. And the figure I'm interested in is located in the bottom left corner. You can see that the individual has really lovely horns, which have been nicely preserved, and we would consider those to be an ideal lyre shape, or the beginning of a lyre shape. It also has a shoulder hump, a rather straight back, and most noticeably, a really lovely tail and tail switch. So this is clearly a bull. The imagery is based off of cattle phenotypical features. Now, it's a very interesting image in that it also has entoptic lines which have been drawn on the body. In this case, however, the dots do not represent entoptic dots, but are rather a color. So this individual is black and red. Now, there are also dashes which surround the body and are raised hairs known as piloerection, or a bull in the throes of death, as stated in Lewis Williams' 1981. So this individual has, or is possibly in a state of dying. And if we look back at the larger image, we can see on the right-hand side, there is actually an individual with a bow and arrow facing towards the bull. There is also a red thread which moves from the back of the bull to the antelope on the right. So what we have here is a really interesting combination of imagery, which might have been lost or misunderstood if we didn't start with the understanding that this is possibly a rain bull, particularly based on cattle. So this is just one of the really interesting examples we have. The second example is a well-known site, the Melrose Panel, which has been published quite a number of times and looked at, and is quite well known. So hopefully you can see some of the details in the photograph below, but this is the tracing and redrawing. The image I'm interested in, however, is located slightly to the left of the same panel, And this was explored briefly by Whittleson in 2019 in relation to the rest of the Melrose sites. So this is the image that we're going to be looking at today. So on the screen, you can see the original tracing and hand drawing by Dowson. Whittleson noted that there are some important details which were missing from this panel, probably due to the preservation and the limited technology. So nowadays we would use a combination of photography and de-stretch to assist our tracing, which makes it much easier to pick up on other unnoticeable details. Note that there is apparently a single individual with lyre-shaped horns, and that is this figure over here. So we can see the horns very clearly. They were well preserved, and that gives us an indication that this individual is based off of cattle features. But the rest, there's some detailing, but we've got some patchy areas, distinctly missing information, which was interesting because it relates to our cattle imagery. So here we have the photographs from site, which have been put through de-stretch and reveal some of the details which were missing from the original tracing. So we can see here that the figure, which previously was just a blank head, has quite lovely detailing. And there's some extra horns coming in, which the de-stretch picks up really nicely. So for those of you who aren't aware, de-stretch changes the way the color is represented. So in this case, I've made the reds pop, which allows me to see more of the details because this was all painted in red. Now, through combining all three source materials, so the original tracing, the photographs, and the de-stretch, I was able to create a digitally constructed drawing of the panel. And this revealed some of the features which were of interest to us and cattle. And here we are. So this is the digitally reconstructed drawing. In this case, black is the red, the stipples are color, and white is white. So I just want to give you a minute to look at that because I think some of the details will hopefully be quite obvious, which has popped up. And those would be the extra horns. And you can see that all the individuals in this panel actually have horns of some variety. Now, three of them are particularly interesting because they appear to be very much cattle horns. So what we have here is that lovely lyre shape that we've been talking about, with, in this case, a very distinctive pole, which may or may not be related. And here we have our original, who we noted had cattle-shaped horns. And then on the right-hand side, we have another individual with cattle-shaped horns. We also have some more details coming in on these individuals. So all in all, I think it was a very satisfying process to go through to reveal some more cattle imagery in this panel. Now, this is not cattle as we would expect to see them and as I've been showing you. So we expect to see cattle with all the bits attached, but what we have here is we have cattle with human and animal features. So we have parts of the cattle, such as the hooves and the horns and the ears, and then we have more human characteristics. So these features possibly identify them as trans-therianthropes. So here we have cattle in trance. And our final site for today, back to the site which is located along the Little Pot River. This is a slightly hidden panel, so it's a little bit separate from the rest of the main shelter. And that shelter being the one with all of the cattle imagery I was showing you at the beginning. So really quite a lot of cattle painted in this particular part of the valley. And here we can see it's really beautifully detailed, and we've got quite a lot going on. So I'm going to talk to you about it from the tracing itself. Right, so this is the tracing and digital drawing of the panel. What we can see is a circle of seated figures, some visibly clapping and wearing karosses or cloaks. So you can see some other details, but those are the main details of the seated figures. Above them, they are encircled by a line of bags, bows, and arrows, which follow the curvature of the rock face. So here we can see this line represents the curve of the rock face, and they're sort of nestled beneath it in this lovely curve. Here you can even see some of the arrows bound together. So these are bags, bows, and arrows. And superimposed on top of these images are a herding figure with a cloak and stick, herding fat-tailed sheep. There's 4, some in white, one in red, and cattle, this guy over here. So he's painted in red. So in this case, the red is black, as you can see, and he has lovely white detailing. And then slightly above the main panel in the top right, we have another herding figure with a herding stick and a cloak and a singular individual. So here we have a really lovely example of placing cattle in a very particular context. So we can begin to talk about how these cattle might possibly be related to the imagery that it's been superimposed upon, and what kind of understanding that gives us, what kind of layers, what kind of interpretation we can take from this. And as you can see, these are short-horned cattle, which obviously opens the floor for a conversation about what kind of cattle we're seeing here and the potential identity of the herders. So this is just to give you a taste of how cattle come into context in the Eastern Cape and within the Maclear district specifically. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I think that's roughly the end of my time. I hope that some of my work has created some interest in how cattle are being painted in the rock art and their potential for engaging with conversations about contact. And I think there's a lot that can come out of this, and a lot more work to be done, but a pretty good start. So thank you very much. Could I open the floor for questions?
Thank you very much, Francis. Yeah, any questions? Peter?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Hi, Francis. Thanks for that very interesting, informative presentation. I'm not sure how far you are on the road of your studies here for your thesis, but you must have been starting to think about the possible symbolism of the cattle, and perhaps even if there are any differences in the symbolism between the different breeds. Maybe you'd like to share your thoughts about that.
Of course. Very much in the end stages of my dissertation, but beginning stages of looking at cattle and interpretation. So my master's was obviously quite limited, but I did start to look at what kind of context we were seeing cattle in, which some I've shown today. But what I did find is that the cattle we're most commonly seeing in the Maclear district are Nguni cattle. So they're very much patterned. They have variable horn shapes. They're longhorn cattle, and they're physically similar to the Nguni cattle breed. And what that means, of course, is that there's a probable relationship between the cattle we're seeing and Nguni people in the area. So it's most likely an indicator of a relationship between Nguni agropastoralists and San hunter-gatherers in the Eastern Cape. And what some of that means is that we can start to look at the ceremonies that might be represented and the rituals that might be represented in the rock art. And we know from previous research that there is a definite relationship between Nguni and San rainmakers. So that's where the rain bull is particularly interesting, because we can see that there's an image there which we can look at a bit more in detail and start to understand how cattle are potentially coming into that rainmaking process. From both sides, from the Nguni side and from the San hunter-gatherer. So that's sort of where this was heading.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. David?
Go ahead, David.
Hi everyone. Francis, thanks very much. It was great to see some of those redrawings. They're really fantastic.
Thank you.
I was wondering if there's anything that you've seen out of the cattle paintings that you've looked at, that you've traced, that you've redrawn, that you think might lend itself to identity or saying something more specific about the chronology. For example, are there breeds where you can say that's definitely kind of, last few hundred years, or something that's a bit older, in other words, sort of pre-colonial, before the arrival of European breeds? Is there anything that clear, or is it more complex than that? Thanks.
Thank you. So that's also another fantastic question. I would say it is very tricky to do any kind of chronology based on the imagery, just because we really don't have a lot of archaeological material to work with to begin with. So I think the lack of that would lend itself to speculation rather than anything useful. However, what I did have is a really lovely site, which is Craigmore, and has colonial imagery. So what we have there are we have oxen which are attached to a wagon being pulled, and those individuals do look different from some of the other paintings of cattle in the area. And I think that could be an interesting thing to explore. So how are the cattle being painted once we have colonial influence? Are they changing? Is the structure, the phenotypical features changing? Because those would have been a result of a combination between indigenous and breeds which were brought in by the Europeans. And in that case, we might actually start to go, well, these might be Afrikaner, because Afrikaner, even into the historical record, there's images of Afrikaner cattle being attached to wagons and being used to pull wagons. So I think there's room to explore that, but unfortunately, I don't think it's possible to use it to build a chronology as yet. But thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the answer.
Do we have any others? Well, then I have one, very briefly. So I think sometimes especially when we're looking at colonial era subject matter, it sometimes tends to get overlapped with a judgment based on style. So sort of Sam and Brent Sinclair Thompson did that sort of disconnecting on them, sort of more poster style, sort of chalky pigments, very sort of flat images, and some of those tending to be sort of more colonial in context and content. So you relied on a lot of very clear. It was very good for a presentation, the redrawings and the like, but in some cases they looked pretty traditional, for want of a better term, not wanting to draw hard distinctions. But would you say that maybe in your subject sample that you found like a distinct sort of traditional colonial style / pigment tendency, or is it more diverse? Is it some of it a bit more sort of traditional, a bit more contact? What's your take on that?
I don't think my sample size is big enough. I think that's the basic answer of that, because what we had is such a variety of different pigments coming through. So some were chalky, some were looking slightly more traditional. The technique looked slightly more traditional, as we call it. And then we also had like the example with the really longhorn cattle, that's slightly more block shaped, a bit more rough. The pigment's a bit chalky. So I think now we have a starting point for what we expect to see when we look at cattle. I think it would be worth exploring, okay, how is this changing? Can we possibly say anything about what the pigment indicates in terms of which part of contact this may have been coming from? But yeah, unfortunately, there was too much going on and not enough at the same time in the sample size.
Cool. Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you.
Anybody else? We are overwhelmed.
Hopefully not underwhelmed.
All right. Well, if no one else has any other comments, I'll say Peter Job. Go ahead.
Hi, Francis. Yeah. In terms of the again of the symbolism of the cattle, I mean, one of the obviously symbolic forms of it is where you get the theranthropic forms of part cattle, part human, and that's sort of an indication of a sort of deep kind of intrusion into the heart of trance symbolism in the art. Have you looked at other sites? I'm thinking particularly of the sort of classic fantastic site in the Lesotho, woodlot, or I think it's Hamaketa, which has got the wonderful it's the best example of cattle of symbolism you're going to find, really. Are you looking at other sites like that just to compare them to those in your area, or are you sticking mainly to just to your particular area when you look at sites, or are you doing a sort of comparative survey in any way?
So it's really difficult because obviously the scope is only within a master's dissertation, because ideally what I would like to do is then take this further. So to take the instances that I do have where cattle are being represented in a slightly more obvious symbolic context and compare it to similar imagery that we know about, like the example in the Lesotho. I think there's actually quite a few. And even coming from the Stormberg, I've seen a few that would be really interesting to look at. But I had to really compact everything. So what I did instead was I looked at how the imagery itself is being represented. So how are cattle being painted in that context itself? Because really my goal is to say, well, cattle are interesting. We should be spending more time looking at cattle because they can tell us something. And not just that there's a change, that there's a shift in symbology, but actually the cattle themselves. So I was looking also at links between how color is being used, and just touching on how color is being used and what that might mean in an Nguni and a San context. And particularly then with the therianthropes, you've got a mixing of ideas and symbology. So it was really just a starting point, but ideally I would like to take that further.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. All right. Well, I think we're very near to the end of the time slot for this talk. So I think if anyone else, unless anyone else has any really pressing questions, I'll say thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Francis for the insightful and definitely outside of my sort of frame of reference. I hadn't come across this before, so I quite appreciate it. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for listening to my talk today, and fantastic questions. So thank you, I appreciate it. And thank you, Andrew, for organizing the seminar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye.